a little bit of a deep dive discussion on, threats are responding to this pandemic as well as us. Every aspect of our lives has been touched by this, personal lives and work lives, and threats are changing up. And so really excited to get both Alex and Sherrod's perspective on this and have a little bit of a discussion about what does this mean for us as analysts and defenders. And if you have any questions throughout the webcast, feel free to just type those into the questions panel. We'll get to as many of those as we can. And this webcast is being recorded, so you can download the slides later. We'll have that link up at the end, but it's basically where you registered for the webcast. So I'd like to start with what are we trying to do here with STAR, with this webcast? Trying to bring you the inside scoop. Threat analysts are talking about different issues every day, and part of what we try to do here is also bring you different voices and different perspectives. And it's one of the reasons I'm so excited to have both Alex and Sherrod here, and I'll chime in as well with what perspective I have on this. And each of us has different visibility, and that leads us to different perspectives on threats. So that's really why we're here, and our goal for today to give you some actionable takeaways. You can go back and better advise your organizations on how to protect themselves. Our agenda for today, if you've joined us in past months, sometimes we'll start with, me giving a rundown of recent things, but I just saw you 2 weeks ago, so I want to dive right in and into two lightning talks. Alex and Sherrod are both going to give you perspectives from their organizations. Then we're going to have a bit of a discussion. If you have questions, please drop those in. I have a couple questions that I've been wondering about. I've been talking to analysts in this community about, so we'll have a discussion there. And then we'll wrap it up. I'll give you a couple things maybe to think about and take away action items for you. With that, we'll dive right into our lightning talks. First up, my pleasure to introduce Alex Guirakhoo from Digital Shadows. He's a threat researcher there. And Alex, I invited him because I saw a bunch of his blog posts. He's been talking about how threats were responding, what they're seeing in dark web, and he's going to dive into some of that today. Fun facts about Alex, he's really into Shiba Inus. He has one, and also has a background of master's in intelligence and national security from King's College. I have a similar background, a master's in intelligence and security studies, so you'll kind of get a sense of Alex's background as he starts to present his findings. So Alex, I will turn it over to you. Go ahead.
Thanks for the introduction, Katie. I'm super happy to be on here. So my work at Digital Shadows primarily focuses on the cybercriminal landscape. And with regards to COVID-19, I've been doing a lot of research on how that landscape has reacted. The pandemic hasn't just affected one area of the world, it's affected absolutely everyone, and the cybercriminal landscape is not immune to this. So what's been interesting is following it from the very get-go, and my main findings has been that it's been a little bit of a double-edged sword. So I'm going to get more into what exactly I mean by that in my slides here. So one of the first things I did was I had a look at Google Trends, which basically classes different search rankings on Google and looks to see how they rank, among other searches within a specific period of time. And what's not so easy is to get that same kind of data on the dark web. There's no real Google of the dark web, at least not as big as Google is. So I used some of the tools that we have at Digital Shadows to come up with a chart of my own. And as you can see here on the purple line, that's the information from Google Trends. And the teal one is the one that I superimposed on there from the data that we have from the dark web. So as you can see there, it follows a pretty similar trend, which isn't all too surprising. There's generally, trends on the dark web typically follow the trends that we see, on our everyday lives, right? What's popular for us is typically also popular for discussion on a lot of the dark web forums and marketplaces. So here, everything really started kicking off around January 20th, and it also follows a lot of the media discourse, which I touch on in a later slide as well. So the immediate reaction to the COVID pandemic, it started off with a lot of phishing, a lot of scams, and some misinformation campaigns. And Sherrod's going to get more, dive more deeply into that. But again, it follows real world trends. And one thing that's pretty interesting to see is when you look at the registration of domains related to COVID. So I pulled the information of WHOIS records of all the domains that have been created with various COVID-19 related key terms ever since, the beginning of January up until now where we are in April. So it started really around, the beginning of March. You had this giant influx of domains, thousands of domains related to COVID being registered on a daily basis. And while most of them aren't necessarily malicious, a lot of them are just parked, not hosting content, there are a couple of them out there that are hosting things like sales of bulk face masks or even sales of ventilators, which I found very interesting. And you had a lot of misinformation towards the beginning as well. Here on the right, you have a picture from an official spokesperson, warning their country about fake news or misinformation that can have a really detrimental effect to people that are already impacted by the pandemic. So broadly speaking, cybercriminals, like I mentioned, have been attempting to profit from the situation, taking advantage of people's fears, people's uncertainty for their own financial gain. So what they've also been doing is they've been adapting to target what's popular. So here are a couple of screenshots I've taken from some cybercriminal forums. The one on the left is from XSS, which is a Russian language forum. I've had that machine translated because not everyone over here can read Russian, myself included, to make that a little bit easier to see. And what the cybercriminals have been doing is they've been looking at ways to profit off this. That's, again, something that we expect. This happens every time there's a major global event, things like natural disasters, even pandemics. We saw this happen with the Ebola pandemic a couple of years ago. Just people trying to exploit people's fears, exploit people's uncertainties, and also try to leverage the ways that we as consumers have reacted and how this has shaped and changed our habits. So in this case, for example, I've seen discussions on the cybercriminal landscape about how, because everyone is now at home, not going to stores, they're going to be doing more online shopping. And from that, things like carding, it could be easier to hide fraudulent transactions if there's just a greater bulk of transactions being made out there. I've also seen discussions about cybercriminals discussing how to target less savvy consumers, right? Not everyone is going to be used to doing all of their shopping or all of their work online. And so they're taking advantage of this to, push phishing emails or try to harvest their credentials. They've also had to adapt a lot of their business models, and this has been most evident on places like dark web marketplaces. One of the first things I saw was on places like Empire, which is a very popular dark web marketplace, things like face masks, hand sanitizer being sold. These are things that don't typically get sold on cybercriminal marketplaces, but all of a sudden, because that's what people are after, that's what people are in need of, then they're going to move towards what can they make money off. And it's not even just new sellers that have popped on these marketplaces with the express intent to just sell these medical supplies. It's also established sellers. So a lot of prominent sellers that typically sell things like hard drugs, narcotics, just all of a sudden moved to selling hand sanitizer. It's really interesting, and I haven't seen that broad of a shift in the marketplace landscape until now. So that was really interesting for me to see. You've also seen things like chloroquine being sold on dark web marketplaces, which is also something I haven't typically seen. And that's not just dangerous for people who go on the dark web to, buy drugs and take them without really knowing the implications of it, but it also has a really negative impact on the people that rely on those things genuinely. Chloroquine is used to treat things like malaria, like lupus. And by hoarding things like that, or hoarding face masks, hand sanitizers, etc., that can be very, very dangerous. You also have things like antibody test kits, which I found amusing. There hasn't been too much of this on the marketplaces. I saw a couple of examples. One of them you can see there on the right, but I did find that interesting. I've also seen a bunch of domains that have been created that claim to sell antibody test kits in varying bulk quantities. And again, that's not really something that you see normally. But there's also been a detrimental impact on cybercrime. Katie, like you mentioned before, everyone is impacted by that. So cybercriminals have had to adapt their business model as well because, people are traveling less. So there are few opportunities for the criminals that typically engage in travel and event fraud. I've seen examples of cyber criminals reaching out for help saying, this has affected my entire business. No one is traveling, so I can't do any of the fraud that I normally do to make my own living. Things like ATM cash outs, bank drops are impacted. If people can't gain physical access to their banks because they're closed, they can't do the bank drops. You also have, interestingly enough, marketplace sellers adding additional precautions to their listings. I saw this as an attempt to, promise buyers that their shipments will be safe. If people are worried about contracting COVID via the mail, they say, we're going to sanitize all your shipments before sending them out. There's also an argument to be made that because a lot of people are unfortunately losing their jobs right now, there's less disposable income overall. And so cyber criminals are going to have to adapt to this to entice their buyers, things like these sales, these COVID-19 related sales. People are using the name of COVID-19 or coronavirus to put discounts on things like drugs. And this happens quite often. First jumps to my mind is what happens around Black Friday. You have a lot of Black Friday deals on the dark web. And this is a very, very similar response that we've seen. There's also been, weirdly enough, another side to the coin. There's been, what's surprising to me, there was some resistance to taking advantage of the situation. There have been discussions on a lot of forums that are typically used for hacking, typically used for cybercrime, that have just consisted of fairly or weirdly normal conversations. People talking about how worried they are about their families, how worried they are about their loved ones. There have been discussions about people sharing from their own perspective of how the pandemic has affected them and how it's affected their country. People have been sharing ways to stay safe. And there's just been this general level of sympathy that shows that while there is all of this stuff going on, people are definitely taking advantage of the situation. There's also been this example of Cybercriminal Code of Ethics, and that'll depend a lot on which forum you're looking at or which people you're looking at. But typically, cybercriminals do have this code of ethics. If, for example, someone were to, aside from the COVID pandemic, if someone were to go and say that they would specifically target the elderly population, there might be more resistance from other users, as opposed to if they said that they were going to target, Fortune 500 company that has a lot of money at their disposal.
Alex, I wanted to jump in here, dive in a little bit, because I don't read dark web stuff every day. That's not my daily visibility, but I was really intrigued by the blog post that you and your team Digital Shadows did on this about criminals, like criminals with a heart of gold. I was curious if you've seen any changes, like based on your visibility. I'm worried about my family. Like I've heard, maybe let's not attack hospitals or healthcare, but then I've seen other, sources that say healthcare is still under attack. Have you seen any indications that criminals are kind of backing off, or from your perspective, is it sort of business as usual?
For the most part, I would say that it is business as usual, and a lot of the reactions that we are seeing are to be expected. A couple of weeks ago, you had some of the major ransomware groups come out and say that they wouldn't specifically target healthcare organizations, and if they did, that they would give them free encryption keys. But even though two of the major groups are saying this, that's not to say that everyone has to follow that, or even that they have to stay true to their word. We've still seen healthcare organizations being targeted right now, and it's really, really a shame, because that's should be the least of their worries right now. They have so much other things to worry about right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And like organizations like that are honestly, as a threat analyst, like giving me motivation to keep going. Like some days when I know we all get distracted, but thinking about like the work that we all do helps protect a lot of these organizations. So I don't know about you, but definitely helped keep me going a little bit. So really interesting to kind of hear from the adversary perspective what they're talking about. And I think it's sort of this prisoner's dilemma that if even one adversary decides, well, I'm going to back off and not target healthcare companies, well, there's someone who's going to step in and do it. So even if, maybe one or two, like the hackers with a heart of gold would back off, others might step in. I saw something, I don't know if it was a Forbes article, something interesting this morning that said, sort of as you said, Alex, like even, adversary incomes, the amount that they're getting from these criminal operations has dropped, 30%. So in a time when, yeah, a lot of people are losing their jobs, adversaries are losing their income as well. So it's hard to feel bad for them. I don't feel bad, people who are stealing, but kind of an interesting to think about that adversary perspective. Awesome.
Exactly.
Anyone
One of
else?
the first, yeah, just one of the first things that I thought when I saw this phenomenon was like, I don't know whether to feel good or feel bad about this, just because of how strange it was to see them react in this way.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard to feel bad for anyone who steals things, but
Exactly.
A really interesting human emotion. So awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Alex. And we'll come back to dive in a little bit more in our discussion, but appreciate the overview, especially, as I said, this is not something that I look at every day. So appreciate you bringing your perspectives.
For sure.
With that, we will move on to Sherrod DeGrippo. Sherrod's the Senior Director of Threat Research and Detection at Proofpoint. And actually what gave me the idea to bring Sherrod on was one of her tweets that I think I showed last time. She tweeted about how they're seeing so many different lures. Proofpoint has a ton of visibility into malicious emails. Sherrod, I'd followed her for a while on Twitter, followed a lot of her work. She's been doing this for over 16 years, speaks quite a bit. Also gave us an amazing tip that in Zoom, there's actually a setting where you can improve your appearance. So just one of the many things that Sherrod has done that I appreciate. So Sherrod, please, over to you. Love to hear your perspective on this.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Alex. That was really cool. Yes, I will take any appearance improvements that I can get on the webcam. So let me just sort of lead everyone through, I'm not getting there we go. So we have been looking primarily through the email and network stream to find what we think has changed on the landscape in terms of COVID-19. We are seeing a significant shift when it comes to social engineering. So in terms of the data that I'm looking at every day, I do network indicators and we write signatures for Suricata and Snort, both for hunting and for full-on detection for your IDS. And we look at about 5 billion emails a day. So we've seen over 400,000 messages that have in some way been malicious and referenced COVID-19. And that encompasses themes that are not just the word COVID-19, but things talking about coronavirus or masks or PPE that are then somehow malicious, either with credential phish, with malicious attachment, malicious URL, etc. We've seen over 231 discrete campaign attempts. And so when I think of a campaign, I categorize campaigns as a specific actor taking a specific time-bound attempt at doing something malicious with their targets. Since January 29th, we've seen over 231 discrete campaigns. Those are primarily seen Monday through Friday during business hours of whomever they're targeting. What's in those campaigns? Everything you can possibly imagine. So all of the things on the left that you would normally expect, malicious attachment, malicious URL, credfish. We've seen BEC and email fraud. I'll show some examples of that next. But what I've found interesting is that you'll get an email that has, for example, a banking Trojan attached to it. And it's a malicious Excel macro. And the file name is the only thing in that entire email that references coronavirus or COVID-19. So they're traditional invoice, malware, social engineering combos that we have always gotten. Instead of just saying invoice, it'll now say coronavirus invoice. And the body of the email is the same, the malware is the same, but the file name or the domain name somehow reference the pandemic. The number one question I've gotten is about payload. The payloads on the right are just a sample. The payloads that we have seen leveraging social engineering to get their victim to take an action using a coronavirus theme are the same payloads that we have seen for time immemorial, for all of the past. Everything that was on the landscape 6 months ago is still on the landscape in relatively the same way. There is not new malware in any specific volumes. There's no new actors in specific volumes. So we're really seeing the same payloads. The differences for us are the lures. So this is what I'm seeing every day. This is an example of BEC email fraud. It's one of the earliest BEC email frauds that we saw leveraging the concept of coronavirus. And this one, the threat actor is essentially saying, 3 people have tested positive in my area, so I can't go out. And for those of you that are familiar with BEC, you know what happens next. They hope for the person to respond. They say that they're unavailable via phone, and they'll go back and forth with them until that victim takes some kind of action, usually wiring money, sending gift cards, all of these kinds of things. So we're seeing it being used in BEC. We're seeing it used in Credfish. And so this particular Credfish campaign I find really interesting because, as you see on the right, the landing page looks great. It really does look like a Facebook page for a special Facebook app. The subject line was coronavirus, everything you need to know to stay alert. So that matches up nicely with this idea of a coronavirus bot that you can download into Facebook app or Facebook Messenger. And another thing that I think is allowing this to be leveraged probably successfully is that there is no single app to get information. The World Health Organization, the CDC, they really haven't settled on an official app. And so people trust Facebook, and then they're willing to put their credentials in to get that application to give them information. Work from home. Many of us in threat research and security have always been remote. So we're seeing our coworkers that are not used to being remote now switching to that. The threat actors are paying attention to that as well. They are sending a lot of themes that are talking about, because everyone is moving to work from home, here's what you need to do. We need to get a position for employees together. And the other thing that I find interesting about this is the URL is spelled out, which is not always the case. And in this particular case, it says, act today or people will die. So they're really playing on the social engineering aspects that incite an emotional response. And I think that that's part of what is making these sort of social engineering to the next level, because it requires an emotional response, and they've already gotten that from people being concerned about their health. Ransomware. We talk about ransomware all the time. Ransomware is a big concern for everyone. For those of you that watch the email landscape, ransomware has really dropped off as a first stage payload when it comes to email. It makes sense, right? Ransomware is really easy to detect. As a first stage payload, you're not getting very far. In this particular case, it was a bit.ly URL directing to another URL. It had a password on the actual zip file. These are all designed, obviously, to do some kind of evasion for detection mechanisms, for sandboxing. But this is NEMT ransomware. And for those of you that are not familiar with NEMT, it has a bit of a whimsical approach. They allow you to upload a file and have one free decryption. So you can do that. And then they also use popular Adult Swim characters, Rick and Morty, on their payment page, which tells you how long you have before your price increases and how long you have before it is completely obliterated, before you can never get your files back. NEMT is really interesting too, because in addition to being ransomware, they started threatening that they would release the files if you didn't pay. So that's part of sort of the full attack chain here, is not just hoping for the money, but threatening that not only will you not get them back, but we will publish them publicly. This was small volume. It was sent to manufacturing and energy companies. There were only 12 in this campaign, so that was relatively targeted. So we're also seeing various verticals and industries being targeted. This is an example of the food and beverage industry being targeted, specifically in Canada. Some of the titles of the victims that received this were Director, Technical Service and Network Management, someone who works on food services equipment, and someone in just a general food services role. This was ersnif banking Trojan. So you can kind of see how getting a banking Trojan onto the machines of people that work in those roles would potentially lead to the threat actor obtaining funds via stealing the login browser session for the people that are doing this work. They could potentially get into those bank accounts. The other thing that's interesting about this one is that the attachment claims that it is the deaths by city and age and the numbers of people that have died, with a sort of conspiracy theory angle of we are being lied to. And this is something, again, they're preying on the emotional state of the people that are receiving these so that they can entice them to take some sort of action, either from curiosity or fear or a variety of emotions that will push that person to click on this, even though they may know that they really shouldn't. So this one was targeting retailers specifically in North America and EMEA. We saw about 300 messages in this particular campaign, and it's focusing on the idea of manufacturing in China. And it's pretty wordy and lengthy for a lure of this type, so I imagine that it may have been either copy pasted from a legitimate lure, a legitimate email of some kind and turned into an email lure, or it's bits and pieces of other emails that were legitimate put together. It's talking about shipping masks to China, teams are in place, and it also is talking about moving manufacturing from their China warehouses and their China factories to factories located outside of China, which if you're in retailing and you're doing your manufacturing in China, this is very potentially important to you. So you can see why it doesn't have as much of an emotional pull. It has more of a get business done, get things taken care of, don't interrupt my supply chain feel. And so it comes across looking quite professional and quite on the level. So there's a potential that people may click on that to make sure that their retailing business is not interrupted. And that was Guloader followed by a rat. So we've also seen targeting of hospitality and retail. In this particular instance, you can see in the lure that they've abused the brand of Emirates Airlines. And it looks like this could have potentially, again, been a relatively legitimate email. It's talking about flight transfers, flight cancellations, how to deal with waivers, rerouting, etc. And these were all sent to people who had some kind of hotel or hospitality role. And you can see the titles of those people on the bottom of the slide. All of the ones that I looked at were based in Cairo. There were 400 messages in this campaign, so I didn't check every single title, but they seem to really have a lot of focus on finance, services, accounting, and people who very likely were traveling as part of their job role. This was Remco's to Ave Maria to LimeRat with a 3-stage payload, which obviously ends in remote access Trojan. But you can also see from the top, they've used an email address that seems somewhat legitimate. So they've created a fake email address. They've marked up this really nice lure so that it looks professional for the most part. So, oh, we already did that one. Let me skip that one. So we're also seeing things like the Red Cross, the World Health Organization, and other brands and organizations of that type being abused. In this particular lure, it's called COVID-19 Safety Tips. The attachment is also called COVID-19 Safety Tips. So it's consistent across the subject and the attachment, which we don't always see. It essentially uses macros to install command and control and a PowerShell implant. But you can also see that it supposedly comes from redcross.ca, so that's a faked sender. This was sent primarily to investment and securities brokerages, as well as real estate. So I would consider this not necessarily specifically targeted at a single vertical, but leaning towards or vertically weighted toward this concept of a financial target. And you can see as well on the PDF or the word macro that comes with it, they've also used the Red Cross branding to encourage the target to click on enable content, which is what allows the macros to make connectivity in the background. So kind of wrapping up on some of the lures, I've got a couple more here. This is another BEC, and I promised Katie and Alex that I would give some hot takes, but I'll allow our BEC actor here to give us the hot takes, which are, my test confirmed that I was sick with coronavirus. They said I had a week before I leave the world. I think this is unfair and I suggest you pay me. I'm sitting at home and not infecting your home. Life or money. Hurry up. Every hour I hate you more and more. So you can sort of see a emotional journey played out in this BEC email that starts out eliciting sympathy, goes to a sort of logic, look, I'm staying home and not infecting you, and then turns into a kind of threatening, angry, send me money, I hate you. I don't imagine that this was super successful, but it's an interesting play on using a Bitcoin address, trying to elicit money with this sad, strange story, and kind of giving a bit of a try to what may or may not work. This was only sent to, I believe, 2 targets. So we'll see if we see more of this Bitcoin address. And if we do, we'll see if they're able to be a little more successful. So this final one that I wanted to show is one that's actually really common, even though this is the only example I have of a World Health Organization logo. The WHO has been abused like crazy in terms of their logo. We've seen multiple World Health Organization branded fake email lures. And so this one is just sort of saying, you know, this vessel is coming into port, so essentially a shipment, crew members can't go ashore. It's giving all of these directions about how to deal with your ship that's coming into port. And this is using Equation Editor with Microsoft Office attachments. It was a combination of a couple of different CVEs that ended in Agent Tesla, which is a keylogger. So we saw this go to 372 different companies. 44% of those organizations were in the transportation business, and then another 15% were in energy. Those were the highest weights that I saw in this particular campaign. I do think that the transportation vertical is being particularly targeted with this one. It makes sense. It's talking about a ship in the port, et cetera. And then getting a keylogger onto someone's machine that works in transportation could potentially result in lots of information, lots of logins, credentials, all kinds of different things that could then be leveraged for compromising other accounts in the future. So that's the essentials of the lures we're seeing. They're coming in all day, every day. But the things that I like to take away from this are that the payloads are the same. The actors that we've generally seen are still here. They're still operating. The email volumes are the same. The things that are different is that we're seeing social engineering at scale, leveraging these COVID-19 concepts. So talking about a pandemic, using a World Health Organization seal, giving ideas of potential deaths in your area. And we're now sending those to distracted employees that have a higher stress level than they've ever had in the past. A lot of people are working from home now, where they used to be in the office. And even if your organization is well equipped for work from home, it is much different to be working from home during a pandemic and not having any coworkers around you to double check things. I think that we should not minimize the realities that many of our colleagues depend upon each other to check what's going on. And if they get an invoice and they say, hey, do we need to pay a coronavirus invoice? They don't have anyone to ask anymore in the same way. They can't just turn around to their coworker that sits next to them. It's the same way for IT help desks. I work remote, but I love going to our office because I go to the IT help desk every time. I want a mouse. I want them to install some new certificate. When employees don't have that option, they might make decisions that are not smart in terms of security. They might say, oh, a weird thing popped up. I don't know. I'm just going to keep going. But if they had an IT help desk down the hall, they might pick up and go down the hall to get help. And finally, we've seen flexible modular downloaders on the malware landscape for probably 2 years heavily, especially in the past year or so, as first stage payloads, as the threat actors start working harder on evasion for their payloads. And I think that downloaders that might be installed on computers and haven't been detected yet could give us an additional problem, because these employees are now at their home, behind their home Wi-Fi, behind their home routers and modems that may not have ever been updated. And so to me, that's kind of the wild card that we're dealing with. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Katie for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sherrod. And as you said, if anyone has questions, feel free to type those into that questions panel in GoToWebinar. But I really love this slide because it kind of dives into a point that we want to discuss a little bit. And there's so much of what you said that honestly resonated with me. It's a little bit different from what I've seen. The fact that, you know, someone used this idea, this theme that act today or people will die. Like, okay, that's a little different than invoice click here. But you know, some of the things you have on the slide about what's the same payloads maybe, but it feels different. That emotional side. I just got a Twitter DM this morning from, you know, someone clearly a scammer. That it was like, I have coronavirus, you know, my kids are hungry, please send me money. And it was actually, usually I dismiss these things like whatever, but it was actually very hard for me to be like delete. Because I'm like, what if he really does have coronavirus? What if he is suffering? You know, using the fact that we're all a little bit scared, a little bit nervous. Another thing you said, kind of, I was impressed by how professional that Facebook app looked. And
I love that one. It looks great.
It looks great. Like some of these adversaries are working hard on their graphics, but the fact that there are no official apps, someone actually commented, Apple has a COVID-19 app. So if there are official apps that maybe an organization, you know, wants their employees to use, that might be one thing to think of. But you know, we all are so hungry for this information. So it sounds like we see those adversaries really trying to leverage that and take advantage of that, which, you know, adversaries, moving on to our discussion points here, adversaries have kind of traditionally, anytime there's something going on, you know, a new theme, you know, the Olympics or the latest thing, click here for news about the election or anything like that, they use these themes. And I think we're used to that, but maybe what we're not used to is the fact that, you know, things that you highlighted, Sherrod, that we're working remotely, that people can't turn around to their coworkers and ask, is this a legit thing I need to pay? Or the fact that we're all maybe a little bit alone or isolated. So here's a discussion question, and I'll come to Alex a little bit. Is this inherently different? You know, you've been doing this, you've been in Digital Shadows for a while now. Is this a little bit different? What are you, you know, telling customers who come to you? Do we need to think differently, respond differently, or is this sort of something similar to what we've seen before? So Alex, curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I really like that last point that Sherrod had. You know, there's an argument to be made that, you know, even though it feels like we're seeing a lot more of this stuff going on right now, there's an argument to be made that, well, in reality, it's really not all too different in terms of volume. It's just that it's getting a lot more attention, and B, affecting a lot more people than it may have otherwise. You know, I think you really hit the point on the head by saying that people working remotely really makes all the difference. If you look at a lot of organizations that don't have an inherent remote work culture, you know, places like schools that don't typically have people working remote a lot of times, that can make a lot of their employees arguably more at risk. You know, like you said, you can't just turn around to your security team and say, hey, look at this email I just got. Do you see anything weird with it? Now, if an organization doesn't have clear guidelines or a clear path to report anything that someone might find that they think is suspicious, it can, you know, prevent people from maybe going down that avenue because they have to go through so many more steps, or because they're uncomfortable because they've never used a lot of these programs that they're suddenly having to use for business continuity now.
That's a really great point, Alex. And in terms of like thinking about, is there anything we need to change? Responding, you know, I've often heard think about like remote options, new tools, but you touched on one, reporting. That, you know, if maybe your organization doesn't have a reporting structure, you're used to people turning around and walking down the hallway to their IT desk, maybe putting that into place. Do you have an email where I can report something suspicious that I've received? So really great point there. We actually had a question come in that, as I'll pivot to Sherrod to ask you to address, what kind of lures and phishing are you seeing targeting hospitals? A question that came in kind of interesting and of course on all our minds. So Sherrod, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. What are you seeing targeting hospitals?
Sure, we really closely look at verticals. That's one of the things that I focus on, you know, for almost every campaign. If we can, we try to see if it's vertically targeted to a particular industry. Healthcare has been getting a lot. Healthcare is probably the most ensconced in this, followed by things like pharma, which is healthcare adjacent, and then transportation. So healthcare, transportation, and manufacturing are getting a significant amount of this, especially things that talk about how to get supplies, how to get testing, all of the things that those healthcare employees are likely most worried about, those are the lures that are being used. And I know that, I want to say it was Krebs that posted that he talked to some ransomware authors and they said they weren't going to hit healthcare. I can't comment on whether or not that is true, but what I can say is general crimeware threat actors are absolutely targeting hospitals and healthcare.
Yeah, I've definitely seen, public links about that as well. So getting back to kind of this question at hand, Sherrod, and as you were talking about, early on in your presentation, you said, well, for example, maybe the file name used to be invoice and now it's coronavirus invoice. Yeah. I'm curious in terms of, has your team changed anything up? Like, do you find it's useful to look for coronavirus and COVID or WHO, keywords, or, the fact that the payloads are the same? Are you all responding differently, or is it kind of similar to what it was before all this?
That's such a great question. So the takeaway that I would share with listeners, and that I would encourage them to share with their leadership, is this: detection is strong, because these are detections that we have used for years, right? I mean, we're looking for static and behavioral indicators of maliciousness. The detection is strong. The intelligence is really the piece that we're all kind of converging around, because now we're having to think about, what are the lures being used? Who's being targeted with these kinds of lures? Who's receiving things that have to do with coronavirus 19? Even though the payload is the same, we're detecting it. We feel strong in our efficacy, but now we have to start thinking much more about adversary psychology. How are they making their decisions? What are they using to try to social engineer people? So I think that we can safely take a lot of that back to our leadership and say, efficacy and detection is strong and we feel good there. Now we're in a different sort of intelligence realm where we're trying to figure out more about what those actor motivations are.
I love that. And I love the idea of putting yourself in the adversary's shoes. I was on the MITRE attack team for many, many years, and that's the whole idea, trying to figure out how adversaries operate, thinking from their perspective. And I'm a huge fan of bringing in psychology and intelligence analysis, Richard's Hoyer, and Alex, I'll pivot to you. Any thoughts on this one?
No, I definitely think that's really interesting. It's good to be proactive. I think in situations like this, if you look at an attacker's perspective, I think it's natural that they're going to be targeting whatever's hot at the moment. So if you look back to the early days or even weeks of the pandemic, there was that initial jump to, using lures like face masks or WHO, CDC notifications. But then now that a lot of companies have worked towards move towards working remotely, all of a sudden you have people that are targeting things like Zoom, communications platforms. All of a sudden you have these domains that are being registered by the thousands for these types of platforms. And I think that that's only going to continue as the pandemic progresses. Whatever is the hot topic of the day is something that someone has to consider. It could be exploited by an attacker.
I think that's so true. And I didn't have an example of this, but what we're starting to see now are threat actors leveraging the idea of stimulus and payment checks. And, your coronavirus stimulus check is attached. Click here to enable macros and you'll download a banking Trojan. And then I think probably the next iteration of that is going to be something about your area has decided to open back up and lockdown is lifted. Click here to find out when you're allowed to leave your home.
And Sherrod, it's so funny that you said about banking stimulus checks. We had actually a comment just come in from their perspective in banking. They're also seeing the same thing, stimulus check or small business administration loans. So Alex, I think you were going to jump in there too. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just really, really interesting how the cybercriminal activity follows the general discourse that we see from our governments or from the media. One example that I had was about chloroquine, right? As soon as, I know there was a paper that came out in early to mid-March that talked about its potential use against COVID-19. And if you look at the amount of domains registered with chloroquine or chloroquine for sale on dark web markets or discussions of chloroquine on forum, it really, really follows that trend in the real life. So as soon as that it goes into the public realm, all of a sudden you have people talking about it on the dark web as well.
Yes, we had a comment come in, someone who said they're furloughed after today. First off, just for anyone listening or anyone who knows someone who's been affected, furloughed, a lot of people being laid off right now, and of course our sympathies to you. Someone asked, well, okay, trying to look at the positive side, I have some time, any community projects, and I wanted to call out, there's basically a CTI league who is trying to come together, different analysts trying to come together and help out. You know, if healthcare organizations need response, need help responding, that's one organization I'm aware of. We had another similar question come in, is there a source to view all malicious COVID-19 URLs? A couple I'm aware of, and we have some references at the end of the slides, which you'll be able to download later. A lot of different companies, Domain Tools, I believe Anomaly, Threat Connect, Microsoft, a lot of different companies have come out with different lists of domains and indicators. So I'll give you a chance, Sherrod, Alex, if there are other community efforts you're aware of or your companies have done, anything you're aware of you wanted to share with folks?
Yeah, no, I think you mentioned a lot of the good ones. I think that is really important if you look at all of those indicators to just not take them at face value, right? Just because you see a domain is mentioning a certain brand or it looks like it could be malicious, that doesn't always mean that it is. So you still have to do a little bit of manual effort, even if you get, a giant list of domains that mention COVID.
Checking indicators is really important. And I did want to mention, Proofpoint acquired the Emerging Threats company in 2015, and we continue to release all of our COVID-19 signatures for Suricata and Snort for free. So if you want free signatures either to hunt or to block for COVID-19, those are available. Just Google ET Open IDS and you can download them for free.
Awesome. So lots of resources out there. I guess that's one of the positives, and I think this community has been doing amazing things, whether it's, free conferences like PancakeCon or these, vendors releasing lists of domains like Emerging Threats and many others. But Sherrod, you mentioned indicators. Alex, you did as well. So I want to pivot to maybe a slightly controversial topic. How much do these indicators help? And, I don't want to, poo-poo people's efforts. As I said, I think it's awesome people are sharing indicators. I've heard from some folks that they've gotten this massive list of domains, as Alex said, trying to vet some of those, always a good thing to do with any kind of indicator feed you have. And I've heard of people who found new compromises as a result. So awesome. But sort of to play devil's advocate a little bit, think of this pyramid of pain. It's sort of, you can't go to any conference without the pyramid of pain popping up, and domain names, IP addresses, easy for adversaries to maybe use new ones, email addresses. And, my perspective here, it's very different. I work for a company called Red Canary. We do managed detection response, and we highly focus on endpoint telemetry. We're writing those behavioral analytics. So, Sherrod, you were talking about those initial lures, and then you were saying, okay, maybe they drop Remcos, their macros in PowerShell, which is sort of where my team focuses. And so for me, there hasn't been maybe as much of a shift in what we've seen. Occasionally we'll see sort of like the dropper, named coronavirus.doc, but in terms of like behavioral things, TTPs that we talk about at the top of that pyramid of pain, not a huge shift there. So Sherrod, I'm curious if you have any hot takes here. How useful are these indicators? Have you seen reuse of them? It's awesome folks are sharing. What do you think?
I told you I had unlimited hot takes, so I've got another one for this. First, pyramid of pain is so important to me. I talk about it all the time. I love that it's 7 years old now, and we're still, I think it's right on every time. If you haven't read that blogspot article, yes, oh, it's so good. But I think that honestly, we have to do the hard work. We're knowledge workers. We have to sit and think, how is your tolerance for FNFP? That's what this all comes down to. If you put these indicators into your system, how is it going to work?
False negative, false positive, FNFP. Yep.
Right. And so if you get FP, who's going to scream the loudest and how upset are they going to be in your environment? And I think that hopefully a lot of people have already done that assessment, because that really is part of your risk assessment is, FNFP tolerance really dictates what we can and can't do. And so you have to decide that for your individual organization, what's going to happen if you have a problem there. I do think that since the malware is really not different, if you felt strong in your efficacy before, you should continue to feel strong in your efficacy now. It's always hanging over us. I'll knock on my IKEA desk. Emotet's not back right now. They tend to come with new and brutal abilities to get through. So until Emotet returns, or until we see something really new on the landscape in terms of technical payloads, I feel relatively good about detection.
Nice. Yeah, and you hit a few kind of important things there, I think, in how, tolerant are you of false positives? Like, I think that every organization is a little bit different. But going back to what Alex said about if you're using these indicator lists, if you find value, awesome. If you can tolerate some false positives, cool, but also vetting those, I think that can help. One comment we had come in that's absolutely relevant here, the Internet Storm Center out of SANS is asking for volunteers to evaluate and score COVID-related domains. So isc.sans.edu/COVID classifier. It's another community effort that if you have some free time on your hands, not all of us do if you're trying to homeschool your kids as well, for example, but if you're looking for something to do, the SANS ISC COVID classifier, maybe, trying to increase the confidence of, is this a malicious domain or not? So a lot of community efforts there, but yeah, I think it's really a balance. And like I said, I've talked to people in the community who they've, scanned their environment, maybe had some false positives, but found some true positives, some actual malicious activities. So yeah, Alex, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think one thing to come out of this, if we want to talk about positives, is just, community reactions and coming together against just a lot of people coming together, different organizations coming together for the bettering of people's security and safety. And that's something that I've really enjoyed seeing happen, because for me, collaboration, I think, is incredibly important no matter when, and especially in times like these.
Absolutely. Well said, Alex. I agree with you. As we start to kind of wrap up and think about action items, I'm curious, and I'll come back to you, Sherrod. You've given us a few different takeaways or things you recommend people do, but what are you, telling your customers, or what should analysts, defenders be doing? What kind of action should they go back? So curious your thoughts on that, Sherrod.
Thanks, Katie. I saved my hottest take for last.
Excellent. Excited to hear it.
So I think that honestly, when we look at this, it's not a technical answer. It's an answer about approach. And I think that we need to approach our colleagues with empathy. We need to understand that if you really believe, and we all should, if you really believe that the threat actors are generally sophisticated enough, then you should understand that most of your workforce that you're protecting are not going to be sophisticated enough to battle a crime war gang from Eastern Europe. And they need you. They need you to partner with them. Their anxiety is much higher than it's probably ever been before. And they want to know that their InfoSec team is friendly, approachable, will not scold them, and will partner with them, whether they're a graphic designer or the chief financial officer, anywhere in that company, that your organization is protected and cared for by their information security teams, and that they know that they have a partner there. I think that InfoSec really, really needs to step up at this time to show we are here for the colleagues that we're protecting, and we're going to do what's right to protect our workforces. I think that that's probably the number one thing that they need to do. They need to be accessible, approachable, and partner with every organization, every team within their organization.
I love that. And I love what you said about empathy. And it's so easy, and I've done this in my history, like, oh, that silly user clicking on that. But realizing that people are scared, our users are scared, and kind of partnering with them, that's awesome. You made me think of, with the word empathy, there's an amazing presentation from InfoSec Sherpa, Tracy from DerbyCon, I think. I'll post a link to on Twitter later, but it's about building a culture of empathy. So that might be a good one to go back and watch. Building empathy. So that's takeaway from Sherrod. Going to Alex. What do you think, Alex? What recommendations do you have for anyone who's working in cybersecurity right now?
I absolutely love that notion of empathy, Sherrod. I can't stress that enough. And I think it goes hand in hand to just have a good security posture within your organization, right? That's always important, but especially in times like these, you need to make it easy for people to understand the risks of what their online activity could possibly result in. Make them aware of common phishing lures, or what they should really be on the lookout for, so that they can themselves keep not only themselves, but also the organization secure, because phishing is still one of, if not the most common social engineering attacks. And by doing that, I think you can foster this culture that people can build off each other. If they're not afraid to talk to their employees, it's even now when they're physically distant, I think that communication, empathy, and just generally educating people and making them aware of the risks that their organization face is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And security awareness, something I have a link in the references that the team at SANS, Securing the Human, led by Lance Spitzner, kind of a force of nature, energetic guy, released a bunch of guidance on that in case you're looking, how do we do security awareness? Before we start to close out, we had another question come in, and Sherrod, I'll probably punt this one to you. Kind of thinking about the effectiveness of different messages, maybe in phishing. So the question is, in simple messages like those we've seen in MITRE, is that more effective? Or maybe if you have more descriptive, extensive ones that combine warnings, conspiracy theories. Sherrod, have you seen any kind of pattern in what's more or less successful, or is it sort of across the board?
Sure, that's a good question. So in my reality, everything that we see like this, we block. So we don't want them to get to a user. But we can tell a little bit what's more successful, outside the line based on what threat actors do. They're sort of these ultimate A/B testers. They'll send a campaign that has maybe coronavirus lures for half and non-coronavirus lures for the other half, but they'll send them in a mix. And we've seen a shift over the past couple months to using more and more of that theme, which to me is a big indicator that it's working. And then the choices that threat actors make are based a lot on who they're actually targeting. So they'll, like we used to talk about network reconnaissance, you go, you scan the network, you see what ports, protocols, and services are available. They're doing that to humans now. They're saying, who are you? What do you have access to? And what might you be susceptible to? And we see things that are custom crafted for the individual or for the type of individual based on job title or industry vertical or even male and female. I've seen that as well. I've seen different lures sent to women than are sent to men.
That's fascinating. And, I love, how you talk about doing analysis based on the choices adversaries made. You might be able to kind of tell what's more or less successful. Alex, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, a lot of phishing lures are going to really depend on who the criminals are going after, right? You're going to use a completely different lure if you're just sending out a mass spam email as opposed to a singular BEC attempt. A lot of times those BEC attempts, especially things like whaling, are going to be highly customized. It's going to have required a large reconnaissance effort on the attacker's part to really get all the details nailed down to make that attack incredibly successful. And then on the other hand, those emails that are distributed to a really, really wide audience, there's this argument that I have is that, a lot of times when you see phishing emails, the formatting is really, really bad. There's a lot of grammar mistakes, there's picture errors, there's formatting errors. And I'm thinking to myself, why is this? Like, surely they're smarter than this. But then I started thinking, and I did some reading, is that a lot of times that's actually on purpose by having that really, really bad formatting. While to a lot of people like us, we'll look at that and be like, hey, this looks off. I'm not going to fall for this, obviously. But then again, we're not the target audience. The people that are going to fall victim for that are also in the subset of people that are more likely to hand over their personal information. So a lot of times threat actors are fully aware of this, and they know exactly how to get the target audience that they want.
That is absolutely right. That's exactly what's happening. If you click on it, they know you're an easier mark.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of times too is that some algorithms that are used to detect those types of emails, if they split up the formatting, if they use different characters, that might also be an attempt to trick the algorithm so that the email is less likely to end up in the spam inbox.
Great points. And all going back to maybe training those users as much as you can, but I love what you both said about empathy, having empathy for our users right now. So important. So just some key thoughts, takeaways. Really appreciate both of your insight. And I think it's really interesting because you both have different perspectives, as do I, but starting to converge on these common things about targeting. One takeaway for everyone, thinking about your threat model. What are the adversaries, and we kind of ended up talking about different targeting patterns. What are the threats that matter to you? Are they changing? Go back and talk to your security team, your defenders. Are you seeing things different? Are threats changing it up a little bit, or is it mostly the same? And as a result of that conversation, do you need to change how you defend? We've talked about throughout this webcast that, and as Sherrod said, a lot of the detections that we had before, they're still working. So not like you need to change everything, but maybe based on that idea of empathy, we need to have a little more empathy for our users, maybe focus on user awareness or on thinking about remote threats and how those affect us. So just a couple go-dos, some action items for you. And at that, I think we're right at our hour. Here's some other references. Great posts from Alex, his team at Digital Shadows, Sherrod, her team at Proofpoint, and a bunch of other references. There's been amazing things, as we said, from around the community, different perspectives on this, lists of domains and indicators sharing with each other to try to help us all better protect against threats that we face.
Love that.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Sherrod. It was wonderful to hear your perspectives. As we said, you can find a copy of the slides on that page, and this is being recorded, so share this with your friends. With that, thank you so much all for joining us. Please stay safe, take care, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks,
Thank you so much, Katie. Thanks, Sherrod.
Thanks, Alex. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good one.